brief to say, to start with, about yourself, then please do so. The microphones are on, but sometimes they not very good to pick up. So please, can I ask you to raise your voice a bit? Okay. So can I start?
Thank you. My name's Tim Carey. I'm National Product Director for Willmott Dixon. We're a privately owned main contractor, turnover about $1.5 billion a year. And I chair our national team looking at innovation off-site. I'm also a member of Build Off-Site as well.
Okay. Thank you, my Lord Chairman. I'm Rosie Toogood, Chief Executive Officer of Legal & General Modular Homes. I joined the business about 10 months ago, having spent a 25-year career in Rolls-Royce Aerospace, leading engine development programs, supply chain management and manufacturing businesses. And at Legal & General Modular Homes, we've invested over $50 million in designing and manufacturing and assembling modular homes. We're just at the point where we're going through the final stages of pre-production and about to go into production. And we aim to address the social and affordable housing market initially and the later living products following that.
I'm Jamie Ratcliffe. I'm the Assistant Director of Housing for the Greater London Authority. I'm responsible for a budget of about £5 billion, mainly to invest into affordable housing. I'm a passionate advocate of innovation in the construction industry. I was on the advisory panel for the Farmer Review of the UK construction labour model, and in a personal capacity also wrote a piece for Policy Exchange called Mass Delivery of Manufactured Homes for Rent.
Well, thank you very much. If I can start off, in exploring the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages, or if you prefer, for off-site manufacturing, the advantages and disadvantages, what is it that makes people go for off-site construction? I.e., what are the key advantages they see in going off-site construction? You might also, to the other side of the coin, what is it that puts them off? What are the disadvantages?
In order? Sorry, do you want to do it in order? Or?
No, anybody can start, and all of you can contribute.
Okay.
Can I go first?
Yeah, you go.
So I think in terms of advantages, speed is a clear advantage in terms of ability to deliver in shorter timescales. The quality of the products that are delivered is a really important advantage that we can bring, and certainty of cost, more predictability of cost. I think in terms of disadvantages, and I've heard some of the previous panel discussion, it's not easy. There's not a silver bullet to doing this, and it takes a lot of diligence and dedication to get a model that actually works.
Okay. I kind of agree with the advantages. I think the biggest advantage of it is the fact that there isn't enough capacity out there to deliver projects, especially housing, using traditional methods of construction anymore. And we're almost past the point of no return. So we've seen it go in cycles with off-site manufacturing, and it's always reverted back every time we've gone through an economic down cycle. But I seriously think that circumstances are such that we need to be there for good. One of the disadvantages of it is capacity. And I think sometimes the market perception of off-site is something which it's not. So whilst there are a number of larger suppliers, manufacturers like Rosie's company, the majority of off-site manufacturing is still very much a cottage industry. It's still very much men and women in sheds building stuff traditionally, just not at the coalface. And a lot of the off-site manufacturers want to scale up, want to invest, but need certainty. And I think we can discuss upon that later.
I'd agree with Tim's point that there just really isn't an option. So from a housing point of view, if we're serious about building the homes this country needs, we're just not going to do it through traditional construction. And that doesn't mean there's not still going to be lots of traditional construction, but we absolutely need to add to it in new ways of precision manufacturing many, many more homes in factories. In terms of some other benefits, I think I'd stress that point about speed, and I think that particularly appeals to build-to-rent providers, and we're seeing basically everyone in London who's delivering build-to-rent, professional large-scale rented homes, looking at ways they can speed up construction through precision manufacturing of homes, that to them every extra week that they can shave off the construction timeline is an extra week in rent, and that driver isn't necessarily there for sale developers, but it absolutely is for build to rent, and I think that's working well. Another point, picking up Rosie's point around costs, I think particularly that's going to be relevant in relation to small sites, where in London, through the London Plan, we're aiming to see a much significantly higher proportion of homes delivered on small sites, which can be very expensive to deliver through traditional construction. You've got the same overheads on those sites, whereas if you can have a replicable design that you can kind of drag and drop to lots of locations, you can deliver it much more cost effectively. There's also a macro benefit, I think, in terms of economic policy, that London's where most housing growth is needed, but it's also somewhere that's under a lot of economic pressure, that wages are expensive here, and you can build homes in places where there are less jobs, and you can deliver an economic benefit to those places whilst delivering homes where they're needed most. And I think at a countrywide level, that's something that's really important. Just two challenges, if I may. One of which I think fundamental to the way the construction industry works is it's just really bad at partnerships and collaboration. People don't trust each other, and to make this work, you do need that trust relationship. You do need to work together at an early stage. You need to commit to it. You need to depend on your partners and work through the problems. And for whatever reason, culturally, I think lots of people in construction find that very difficult. You'll also hear a lot of discussion around innovative technologies being not tried and tested, and there being problems with them. But I just don't buy that mostly we're not talking about fantastical things like aerogel. It's tried and tested ways of building homes, broadly 3 different ways. Timber frame, which has been around for thousands of years, steel frame buildings, which have been around for 150 years, and concrete frame buildings, kind of 125 years. They're not massively innovative things, but we need to be doing much more of it.
Fox.
We heard from the previous evidence that somehow the development side and the business side is perhaps what's held back the rapid adoption of this technology. The L&G decision to gain control of the means of production, if you like. I mean, one can understand wanting to invest in houses as being a revenue stream that sits in parallel with its business, but what was the decision-making process that went on when you were sat around the table saying, well, we're not just going to build houses, we're going to build a factory that builds houses? So how did you come by that decision?
There were 2 main driving factors. One is, Legal in General is passionate about investing in schemes which deliver socially and economically beneficial outcomes. So that was one.
So you could have done that through traditional manufacturing.
Correct, and we're doing so. We have a number of traditional house builders within the Legal and General Capital portfolio, but we saw a growing gap in capacity availability in the industry, and a growing gap in terms of the skills and competencies required to do so. And really, the concept that we are developing at the factory is all about truly manufacturing homes, not building, as Tim said, in a shed, but actually truly getting to the point where we're designing and manufacturing and assembling homes, creating new skills and new capacity for the industry.
So that's real vertical integration as well in terms
Correct,
of what you're doing.
That's right.
Okay.
I was very interested in what you said, because at this committee a few months ago, we had people talking to us about fusion and fission, and Legal in General, for example, is investing in one of the most advanced areas of new modular fusion energy and so on. So I'm it seems of a piece that you're very advanced. But my question really is, just go from that to the awfulness of last week in the Times. There was a report of them and others visiting a building site. I won't name the name, but if you read last week's Times, and people, houses were being completed with just plasterboard, and people, feet not surprisingly went through. So, is it in fact mass production or modular production going to avoid the kind of errors or problems that you have with ad hoc methods, as it were, traditional methods? I mean, is that one of the reasons, as well as presumably using more advanced techniques? I mean, when you have a situation such as was reported last week, a very major company putting up buildings, people put all their savings in, and it failed. I mean, and many of them failed. Will the use of off-site manufacture help avoid that kind of terrible situation?
Absolutely, it should do. Any other industry, we wouldn't choose to construct something not in the way that we do in construction. We wouldn't build an aeroplane on the runway, would we? And I think that having access, undertaking the research and development to design the product in the right way, to make it suitable for design, for manufacture and for assembly, creates less interfaces than you would do traditionally as well. So in effect, we should be able to produce the same product and de-skill the circumstances to deliver that product as well. There's also much greater control in a factory environment than there would necessarily be out on site as well.
Fox, and then I'm going to move on to Lord Balance.
Did it take a relatively new entrant in the development market to introduce this sort of rapidly? And we've got two examples really of a long-standing developer and a relatively new developer. Do you think the advantage of being a new developer means that you can bring the new techniques in and it's harder when you're an established developer, or is that just a spurious argument?
I can't really speak for Tim. You can follow me, but I think we have a very positive, disruptive mindset in legal in general, and a very determined goal here. That's allowed me the freedom to assemble a team, a great team in Sherburn and Willmott, which is assembled from a number of different industries. We've got people from the automotive industry, aerospace, electronics, construction and design consultancy. And we're melding those skills together and bringing the best of the best of the best from those industries to bring new thinking and new ways of doing things, so that we're truly, understanding the customer requirements, taking that into design, really truly getting underneath the designing to a level of detail that's not commonly seen in construction, so that we can actually expand that into a bill of materials and bill of process, as the automakers would do and the aerospace makers and other standardised industries would, and drive the level of process standardisation and consistency and repeatability that's been proven over a number of years to drive up quality. And that's the journey that we're on. So we've invested heavily to do so. It's not an easy journey to go on, but we're very much we're a long way down the track, and right at the cusp of getting into production and starting to serve in volume the UK market.
You mentioned in particular affordable housing, which is quite intriguing, because one can argue that there is no affordable housing market at the moment. Housing has become less and less affordable as time goes on. And you mentioned in particular in passing the word disruptive. I mean, are we here on the edge of a disruptive technology for the building industry for houses? And is this a step change where you could enter it in a very different way, ignoring much of what's going on in the traditional market, and change the whole thing?
That's certainly what we're about. I use the word disruptive deliberately. We do believe we're tackling the market in a very different way, and certainly designing and manufacturing in a very different way, and that will allow us to scale up the factory rapidly and build it, build in volume.
Is there anything in public policy terms which is holding back that disruptive technology?
I think there's a bit of, so firstly just to say, I think the affordable housing situation isn't quite as negative as you paint it there. I think we're starting to see things change. Last financial year we started the highest number of affordable housing starts in London since devolution of funding to the mayor. There's some high numbers that we're...
In the interest of the committee, can you define what is the price of an affordable house for a couple of bedrooms?
Primarily affordable housing that we're funding is one of three types. For a low rent, basically based on council rents. So for a two-bed home, that was about £150 a week. Secondly, a London living rent product, which is based on a third of local incomes. So on a London-wide average, it varies from place to place, about £1,000 a month for a two-bed property. And
you're talking about a market.
And then-
what about the price to buy?
And then third one, affordable home ownership, which is primarily part buy, part low rents, shared ownership, and the price of that varies from place to place, and you buy a share in it, and you then pay a low rent. But in terms of the income needed to buy it, the average income of people buying those is about £40,000 household income, which is pretty much the same as the average household income across London as a whole. So people who look like ordinary Londoners are buying those homes. But so just coming back to your point on public policy, I think there's something quite significant in terms of the way that housing associations and maybe to an extent local authorities react to off-site precision manufacturing, and that is that they've got an experience of basically being told to do it before. So in the 1960s, the way the subsidy regime worked is councils were highly incentivised to build homes in precast concrete panels. The Housing Corporation in the past basically made housing associations use modern methods of construction. English partnerships through procuring partners on land made people use certain techniques. And that meant they were doing it for compliance reasons rather than being bought into it. And some of the problems that some of them have experienced make them negatively disposed to doing this. And I think it's only when we see organisations fully buy into it and see the benefits, and I think the benefits are around quality and speed, and the arguments of speed that apply to build to rent should apply equally to affordable housing, where you'll get more income in at an earlier stage. And I think some of our partners definitely are seeing that. Swan Housing Association, they've set up their own factory in Basildon using cross-laminated timber. A number of our other large partners are committing significant parts of their pipeline to precision manufacturing homes, but they're doing it because they see the business drivers for themselves and not because they're being told to.
Is off-site manufacturing more helpful for high-rise buildings rather than others? I mean, presumably yes, because the price of land is more than the price of the building itself. So if you're looking at the affordable sector, is there some link between the size of the building you're wanting to build, and the use of the technology?
I would argue that with good design, modular housing can address all markets and all tenures.
Yeah, I can see that, but from a London point of view, where land comes at a great premium, and the value of the land is much higher than the value of the buildings, are you looking to having affordable housing in high-rise or mixture or what?
So we've taken off the brakes on density in terms of the London plan, and are trying to optimise the density in every location, and whether that's on very small sites, very large sites, whether that's kind of mid-rise but packed into kind of mansion blocks, or it's tall buildings in appropriate locations. So there's kind of just a mix of everything. I think most of these technologies do top out at maybe 20, 25 stories, although there's a couple of 30-storey plus steel frame buildings in Croydon. One's student, one's for pocket homes who deliver a kind of innovative, affordable home ownership product. So it can get quite tall. I actually do think that thing on small sites is somewhere where we could see it work very well, where you could have something that was very replicable and could be delivered at very low cost. And there's a couple of manufacturers who we've been talking to who can deliver homes at what look like fantastically low costs, kind of maybe 3-4 story, either townhouses or small blocks of flats. For infill sites around London.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, I was just going to...
Oh, sorry, there was a...
So I was just going to say, I think it's about scale of opportunity as much as scale of building. Most of the technologies can go up, as my colleagues have said, up to the relevant heights. But obviously, one of the barriers at the moment, especially, is there's too many design standards. So, I know it's an often preached thing, but there's a lack of harmonisation of design standards, particularly in the affordable sector. And like anything with manufacturing, the more you can make of one thing.
Whose standards are
These.
So registered providers, London standards, there's various spatial standards, a whole spectrum of them. And the problem is, what that does is put lots of different flavours on what an internal layout should look like. So to get to scale, to get to efficiency, makes it more difficult than it could otherwise be. And I think if we could solve that problem, then we could really get volume.
So my question is, what changes could be made to public procurement processes, in particular for public sector housing, so that we could have more sustainable economic housing? And to add to that, I think one of the points is, which we discussed with the previous one, can we have highly intelligent customers who will, as it were, help this improved procurement process. So there needs more training of all these different organisations that are buying housing. I mean, obviously you have a specialist branch in GLA, but there are all sorts of people who are involved in making these decisions about housing, and sometimes they're all amateurish at the moment.
I would say that in any major change, you know, you've always got the early adopters who are the enlightened advocates of that change, who will, you know, who will move first and who will prove out the concept. And you know, we're working with a number of councils, local enterprise partnerships, and housing associations who fit in that mould. And I know Jamie, through his work on the GLA, is encouraging that also. And I think we will start to see groups of councils and local enterprise partnerships coming together. One of the things that would really help is a long-term pipeline of demand. I think we touched on earlier that the fact that, you know, keeping flow in a factory is really, really important in terms of, you know, driving efficiency and driving quality and improvement. And I think having long-term aggregated demand pipelines in the industry is really important. I think collaboration and changing the way in which, you know, contracts are let, that fits with the long-term aggregation of demand. So you're not, you know, contracting scheme by scheme. You're working in long-term partnerships with some of the major housing providers. Those sorts of things would really help the modular take-off. And I think also helping promote innovation and skills through technology centres, much like the Manufacturing Technology Centre in Coventry and the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre in Sheffield. Those sorts of things can provide a real benefit to the industry.
Just asking, in Germany, the insurance companies, I believe, are quite involved in investment, and I just wondered whether is what you're doing with Legal & General, is that similar to what has been done in other countries in Europe, or is it very new in that sense?
I can't comment directly on that, but
two things were just hung out. But first of all, Mr. Carey, you mentioned the standards issue, and who could drive the standards together, and the second point on aggregating demand. Do we just wait for the councils and local authorities and housing associations to do this naturally, or is there something that government could do to bring these things together and create an aggregated demand? Clearly, in London, there's a big aggregated demand, kind of almost naturally, but outside of London, smaller authorities. What could central government do in both cases to drive standards together and to drive demand, to aggregate demand?
Well, I suppose on the first part, I have to profess I'm not an expert on various groups that could be established, but I would say some kind of specialist group, task force, that was charged with working with various interested parties to aggregate up their thoughts and to deliver a standardised suite of harmonised design standards. Similar things have been done in the kind of medium to longer term past. I think if we leave the industry bodies, registered providers to themselves, trying to get an agreement without an external influence on that would be very difficult, I would think. So I do think it needs an independent body to do that for them, or to work with them.
So I'm pleased to say that we've just procured some work, working with some partners of manufacturers, the large housing association, a build-to-rent provider, commissioned Cast Consultancy in Bryden Wood to come up with the beginnings of a standardisation guide, which would address Tim's point, I think, but from two perspectives, one of which is on the client side of how you can have a more standardised layout, which can be more replicable, can be built at a higher quality, but also on a manufacturer's side of there being too many small manufacturers who have a bespoke product that no one else can do, and that creates a lack of resilience in the supply chain of if only one person can do something and they're quite a small company, if they go wrong, that's a big problem. And so looking at standardised fixings, having different technologies that can fit together if something goes wrong.
Give us a few details, I think would be quite useful.
Yeah, I can certainly send a link to the outline of it, and it will be progressing fairly soon with some more announcements.
Yeah, and we're working with Jamie on that project with CAST. We're one of the sponsors of that activity because we feel that standardisation drive is really important. On the subject of aggregating demand, we're also doing work with the local enterprise partnerships and bringing groups of councils and housing associations together through the various industry and trade bodies to try and create a sort of like-minded group of early adopters who will take on board and work with us on developing the modular products. And I think anything that can come from government to help encourage that positively and in favour of modular would be welcome.
We get evidence from the people you mentioned in due course. But can I move on to Lord Borwick?
The planning system is so often the critical path, most of the critical path of a new development. How could the planning system be changed to encourage the use of off-site construction and make it all happen quicker?
In terms of the current planning system, it's agnostic in terms of how homes are built, and through the development of the draft London plan, it's something that we looked at in quite a lot of detail. And one of the things we explored was could you give some kind of height reward to people who were doing standardised homes on the basis that you might not get as many homes if you've got a standardised block of things that fit together, and so you therefore might need to go a bit higher. But I think that didn't work for two reasons. One of which is we've ripped up the density standards and we've said that the optimum density should go everywhere, so it's about trying to get as much possible. And also, I think in terms of height, because the technologies do top out at a certain level, it might not be that useful to give somebody a height reward. So within the current planning system, I think it's quite difficult. In 2014, I spent some time in California, and they've obviously got a very different planning system to us, but their system of accreditation, which was kind of somewhere in between our planning approvals and building control, they were carrying them all out in factories, some of those factories in the Far East or a long way from California, and able to give certainty and predictability through their equivalent to the planning system by doing that. And it feels like we should be more open to some innovation in that space.
Okay.
As far as you're concerned, what changes would you suggest in order to not to keep it agnostic, but actually to bias the system in favour of off-site construction?
I think the work that we're doing on standardisation will help. I think we find that working with the early adopters, the positive mindset, we're able to get through the issues that we need to get through and deliver.
Lord Fox.
The government's industrial strategy has involved a number of different sector deals, and it was announced, I think, in November that there's going to be a construction sector deal. I think the details are still emerging, so now is your chance to try to feed in what should the construction sector deal focus on in order to deliver the promise that we're hearing for off-site construction.
I think if it's announcing new pots of funding, I think that's not necessarily the most helpful thing, because some of the previous pots of funding that have been announced haven't been deployed.
The information is around pots of funding for things like new construction methods and things like that, so there is an element of that.
So for example, the Accelerated Construction Fund, we've been talking to government for well over 18 months about London's share of that, and whilst I've been told there's been progress made, there's no confirmation of here is the money that you're going to get, or we can get on and do something. We've said we would like to use that money very much to drive much more precision manufacturing of homes, and it's caught somewhere in the machinery of government. If more pots are announced, then they take just as long.
But why?
Point made.
Can you explain why this reservation about introducing higher standards? That's what you're saying, isn't it? That you want to have a higher standard of construction, which this off-site methods will deliver. But you're saying that there's some problem in government about that.
So just deploying funding of the kind of, in London we don't have an automatic share of pots that are announced. We have to negotiate on a case-by-case basis, and sometimes it takes a very long time for us to get our share and be able to do something with it. And the Accelerated Construction Fund is definitely one of the slower ones in my experience.
Town funding is competitive.
Other thoughts?
I would say we need a new sort of mindset in the industry, a new industry approach. So, I'd like to see more collaboration, more long-term contracts, less adversarial contracts, more interdependence and less, power within the relationships, from a down the supply chain. Longer pipelines of secure demand so we can plan and resource and invest and improve the products, and more investment in innovation and skills. One of the key things we're doing is building capacity in the industry, bringing in people and multi-skilling them, making them able to do a number of different tasks rather than giving them just one skill or trade. We're also, developing new skills and trades. So, more advanced understanding around architecture and design for manufacture and investment in that space, and more investment around the logistics and manufacturing flows and manufacturing engineering, and investment in innovation and skills in those spaces would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that, really. I mean, I think the kind of the research and development into technologies remains an ongoing demand for it. I think the more we push higher standards of construction, higher thermal performance, higher efficiencies of everything else as well, then that will, in effect, force us to use more methods of construction, as the traditional ways of constructing houses can no longer meet those requirements. So I think there's a useful lever there, there's some kind of incentivisation for higher levels of thermal performance would be a big thing. I think the frameworks thing is a big thing as well, and we need to acknowledge, I mean, as a main contractor, there's a kind of there's a disparity between the requirements that I need to fulfil for my customers in terms of providing 3 quotations for a particular trade, and my desire to partner and provide a meaningful pipeline to an off-site supplier. And that goes back to trust, and it goes back to evidence. And I think the key thing for me in all of this we talked about, effectively we're asking a customer or an end user to make a different decision, to elect to support the use of off-site rather than something that they know and may think is a better option. And we don't collect enough data, enough output data on projects. And this is something that we're working with Syria on, to try and collect data, because if we're asking someone to make an informed decision, they need to be informed. And I think some kind of lever, again, that we could put in place whereby we can capture outturn data from projects so that we can prove that where we use off-site, we have benefits, we have less defects, more time certainty, lower costs, repeatability, etc.
This seems to be a marketing issue. I mean, is it a marketing issue that Legal in General are addressing?
I think it's a change curve. And as I said earlier, you get early adopters who absolutely get the modular benefits, who are passionate about that and who we're working with. And, as we gain momentum in that space, I think the market will move.
But we do need to bridge the adoption gap. And I think data, again, sorry to reinforce it, but I think data will help us to get over that. And we need to be more explicit about marketing. We still talk in the industry about a World in Action report that happened in 1983 back in timber frame. And that's years and years ago. We need to reinforce the positive messages about off-site and the outturn impacts that it can have as well.
In a way, it's not so much construction as manufacturing and assembly.
Yeah.
So that's the step change.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So it's carried on from really the previous discussion. What reskilling of the construction workforce is required to facilitate a change to more off-site manufacturer for construction? I just add, one of the points we haven't discussed very much is the fact that obviously where you put your houses makes a difference. So if in some areas that I know of in the UK, valleys in Devon and other places where it's much more difficult to put up houses. Is the use of off-site methods going to be just appropriate for nice level areas where you build them, or are we going to be able to use these new techniques in many of the areas in Britain where people live, which are actually quite demanding places with complicated floods and slopes and so on? Will the new technologies be available for those areas as well?
I don't know much about Devon, but if I just take the first part of your question, I think if we had a reskilling challenge, that would actually be a nice problem to have. We've actually got the opposite, which is dramatically reducing construction workforce. The Farmer Review found that due to the age profile of the workforce, huge numbers are retiring and not being replaced. There was what he called a burning platform, and that was before the referendum on leaving the European Union. In London, according to official statistics, and we think it's actually much higher, half the workforce are from overseas. There's a massive challenge without the certainty of what's going to happen when we leave the European Union of having any construction workforce at all. Whatever's left there, we're likely to need to keep building in traditional ways. And so what we're looking at in building in factories is being more productive, so needing less workers per home that's being built, but also attracting many more new people into the industry who will be attracted to working in different places. And I think, for me, that one of the key benefits of moving more homes to being precision manufactured in factories is that you can attract a more diverse range of workforce. Currently only 12% of the construction workforce in the UK are women, so we're basically ignoring half the population in terms of the workforce that we want. Having a safe, dry, fixed place of work where you can have split shifts, you can be more flexible, you can have more oversight, should be appealing to women, and we should be able to get greater gender balance in the workforce, which is one of the things we need to do.
Want to follow up? No.
Can I ask about the issue about off-site manufacture potentially hampering architectural ambition? So the sort of perception that somehow having standardisation of components means standardisation of the end product and preventing architectural interest. You know, could you say what your views are about that?
I don't buy it at all, and I was booed out of the AA School of Architecture a few months ago when I was talking about standardisation of having standard elevation, standard fenestration treatments. I was in their building in Bloomsbury Square where the entire thing is standard, and you've got one of the most beautiful parts of London, so I think some of that's overstated. I think the other thing that's overstated is according to the numbers that my team pulled out for me, there's just over 1 million terraced homes in London. Pretty much all of those are a standard design. It's 2 up, 2 down with an outrigger at the back. Yeah, there's a huge amount of variety you can do within that standard design. Many more of them actually have been converted to flats, so it's probably more like 1.2 million or something in terms of that standard building that can be converted. And I think what we're starting to see, I mentioned the Swan factory earlier, that through manufacturing and having standardisation, you can have mass customisation. You see it in car manufacture, which Rosie might want to say something about, obviously knows much more than me. But Swan, through their initial site where they're offering houses in Basildon, are offering consumers 288,000 options in terms of things that they can vary. And it's very easy for them to offer those options because they're just swapping out different components within the factory. And so you can have variety, you can have flexibility, but you're not sacrificing how beautiful the building looks. You can finish them externally in what you want. You can have a range of different interesting things happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would add that, you know, in many other industries, standardisation is seen as an enabler, you know, a building block for, you know, the added extras and the flair. And, you know, our intention is to create the standard building blocks in terms of the modular design, but also be very sympathetic to the individual housing association, council, local enterprise partnerships needs in terms of creating a different street scene, different orientation of the actual housing, and different fascias and roofing to create nice places to live. And that's, you know, how we intend to work with our clients.
So there is a role for the architect still in implementing design locally.
Creating nice, you know, great places to live, absolutely. Yeah.
Just a point here, we are actually conflating two things here. We're conflating off-site construction and standardisation. Are you saying that standardisation, which has all the benefits you've just described, is impossible to do with on-site construction, or is it, in a sense, that conflation? Do you have to have the off-site delivery to deliver the full benefit of standardisation, or is there an agenda that says standardise on-site construction as well?
I think it's both. I think there's definitely benefits of standardising on-site construction as well.
But it hasn't happened. I mean,
it hasn't. It may not have happened widespread. There are pockets of good practice where it does it. Where we don't have to keep reinventing.
I mean, I'm suggesting that off-site delivery forces standardisation, whereas on-site delivery it kind of sort of drips in from.
But you just said there are hundreds of thousands of permutations you can make. So
yeah, but it's through a standard.
I think the thing about mass customisation, platform-based approach is you get the benefits of both. It's off-site will drive the standardisation, because inevitably, if you're going to design a system from the ground up, you're going to design it with standardisation of components in mind. And in terms of the role of the architect, there will always be a role for an architect. Designing standard components doesn't mean that you don't need an architect skill to assemble those in an elegant, beautiful manner. It just means that you spend your time on that element that matters to the end users and the surrounding vernacular, rather than worrying about how you build a wall or how you build a ceiling time and time again.
I think it's about discipline. That absolutely standardisation would deliver a range of benefits through traditional construction, but because there's no real, no massive cost you can see of just tweaking something or doing something a bit differently, people do. And so there's a site with about 700 homes built so far that we've been involved in, where there's 368 different property layouts. And I don't think that's an architect who's been employed to make a toilet in a slightly different place or a corridor look a bit different, has been utilising his or her skills particularly well. Whereas getting something right, replicating it, would have delivered lots of benefits on a traditional construction. I think you probably don't get all the benefits of the quality, the oversight, the precision that you get from building homes in factories, but you can go quite a long way through standardisation.
Lord Mayor, follow up this point. I mean, Mr. Ratcliffe, because you're of the three of you, you're a client. Would you be giving preference to off-site manufacture in your design briefs to your architects, to your in the business of producing houses? Is that something that you now would see as a preference?
So we don't directly procure any homes ourselves. We mainly fund third parties like housing associations or councils who would be building homes themselves. I think the point I've made before is I think the client has to adopt it, and so I wouldn't want to put rules on our grant that made people go in a certain way, but certainly we've been trying to create a strategic environment where it makes sense for them to push people to deliver homes at speed, at scale, which drives you towards these types of things.
Those organisations that are clients are beginning to get the message about the advantages of off-site manufacture, or do you think there's still a long way to go?
So I think I'm by nature an optimist, but it does feel like we're on a point where we're going to see much more precision manufacturing, and I think the build-to-rent sector driving that, but lots of forward-looking housing associations who very much want to do it at scale as well. And so just some of those with large sites who have signed up to ambitious build programmes who need to deliver at pace are basically, because they've committed to that pace, are therefore committed to looking at delivery in a different way.
Anybody else want to add? Lord Renfrew.
I was very struck by the point made earlier about harmonisation of design standards standing in the way of off-site construction in some cases. And that, or resistance to harmonisation of design standards, I suppose. And that really surprised me, because I've been trying to understand what has impeded the more rapid adoption of off-site manufacture. And that was, I think, the strongest argument that I heard, that I see that could be an impediment to plans being adopted. Is that a fair comment?
Well, I think it was me who made the point, so I would think that's an entirely fair comment. I think, I see that as one of the biggest barriers. Because at the end of the day, you can still do it, but it won't be as efficient as it could possibly be. And I think, I'd agree.
And I think it's how much of that variation is conscious and actually value-adding to activity. And certainly my hypothesis is very little. It's kind of people tweaking things because they can. A designer who's asked to produce a new staircase makes up a new staircase each time.
Yes, thank you.
One of which I asked before, what about energy? I mean, an extraordinarily important part of the buildings are the energy. In the sort of public sector programs you're doing, are you ensuring more uniformity of the energy systems in the houses, or can people choose all their different heaters and refrigerators and other devices, or is that going to be an area in which you can have regularisation and more efficiency?
Yeah. So we believe the way in which we're designing and precision manufacturing these homes makes them more airtight, delivers homes of a higher quality, and therefore, and the use of the fabric first approach allows us to deliver homes which are more energy efficient in the long term. And I think that's driving up standards in the industry across the board. And in terms of adopting new energy systems, the factory manufactured environment allows us to look at innovations in the way in which energy is captured and then stored in order to be able to take homes off grid and be able to deliver new energy solutions.
As I understand what you're saying, it still means that you'll do all this insulation, but people in different houses in a big block will actually use their own different energy devices, whatever it is. Whereas in Germany, there seems to be much greater standardisation of the energy supply in their public housing. I don't know. I wonder whether that's important.
I'm not an expert on it, but I could certainly get somebody to write with a bit more information on our policies in relation to decentralised energy and how that's applied, and that we have adapted the approach in the latest draft of the London Plan. But it's something that in the right places with the right demand of energy, we're certainly promoting a lot. So if it's helpful, I can get some more information and provide that.
New York, for example, it's well known you have centralised heating, which has extraordinary contribution to efficiency. And we don't do that in England, really. It's just relying on neighbours' heat or whatever it is, but it's...
No comment on that. Well, I think our time's probably up, and you've helped us a lot. So can I thank all three of you for taking time out to come and help us. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.